No pay, no glory, no survival guarantee. Welcome to life as a royal food taster in medieval courts, where your sole purpose was to die before your sovereign did. You weren't hired to savor the delectable cuisine of royal chefs. You were there to faceplant into your monarch's soup if it contained a deadly poison. For most of history, being a royal food taster wasn't exactly a job you applied for. The position was typically filled by slaves, prisoners, or servants who'd seriously offended someone powerful. After all, who willingly signs up to be the human equivalent of a canary in a coal mine? Take poor Quincy Hemsworth, a royal food taster for King Henry VIII in 1536. Quincy didn't choose this career path. As a petty thief caught stealing a loaf of bread, he was given the choice between having his hand chopped off or tasting the king's meals for a year. Thinking this was a miraculous stroke of good fortune, Quincy eagerly chose the latter. "You mean I get to eat the same food as the king? For free?" Quincy reportedly asked the judge, who simply chuckled and muttered something about another dead man walking. Your workday as a medieval food taster began hours before the royal actually ate. First, you'd watch the kitchen staff prepare the food, looking for any suspicious behavior like a cook whispering to a foreign ambassador or a servant slipping something into a sauce. Then came the actual tasting, where you'd sample everything from appetizers to wines to desserts. The protocol was painfully specific. At the court of Emperor Claudius, tasters had to wait 1 hour after consuming the food before the emperor would eat it, since some poisons took time to act. Imagine sitting there, staring at a delicious feast going cold while anxiously monitoring your own bodily sensations. Is that a stomach cramp or just indigestion from yesterday's feast? Is my tongue tingling because of poison or because I burned it on that soup? Most days I pray for poison, Quincy once confided to a kitchen maid. At least it would be quicker than this constant suspense. The stress was unrelenting. Every meal presented at least a dozen opportunities to die. And it wasn't just obvious poisons you needed to worry about. Historically, arsenic was dubbed inheritance powder because it was so commonly used to eliminate inconvenient relatives or political rivals. It could be mixed into almost anything, wine, sauce, even sprinkled over fruit, and was often undetectable by taste. And let's talk about the social standing of a food taster, shall we? Despite literally risking your life with every bite, you were considered lower than the royal dogs. At least the dogs got pats on the head. You got suspicious glances from courtiers wondering if you were secretly working with poisoners. During a particularly tense diplomatic visit from French envoys in 1537, Quincy found himself sampling a suspicious-looking meat pie. Upon taking his first bite, he coughed slightly, merely because a crumb went down the wrong way. The entire hall fell silent. Guards drew their swords. The French ambassador turned pale. King Henry's hand moved to his own dagger. "Sorry," Quincy squeaked. "Just dry crust." The collective sigh of relief nearly blew out the candles. The tragic irony of being a food taster was that you had to become an expert in the very thing meant to kill you. Successful tasters developed an intimate knowledge of poisons, learning to detect subtle hints of bitter almonds, cyanide, metallic tastes, arsenic, or burning sensations, belladonna. They weren't trained formally, of course. This was on-the-job learning at its most extreme, survive or don't. Wilamina Northcott, a food taster for Queen Elizabeth I, actually became so adept at identifying potential poisons that she could detect the slightest addition of unfamiliar herbs in a dish. Her refined palate saved the Queen's life twice, and earned her absolutely no recognition whatsoever. When she politely requested a small raise, the royal treasurer reportedly laughed so hard, he spilled ink all over the treasury ledgers. "But I saved Her Majesty's life," Wilamina protested. "Yes, and that's literally your only job," came the reply. "Would you like a medal for breathing air as well?" The dangers weren't limited to poison either. If a monarch got sick for any reason after eating, whether from food poisoning, overindulgence, or completely unrelated causes, guess who got blamed? That's right, the food taster who had evidently failed at their one job. This often resulted in interrogation, torture, or execution. Quincy once spent 3 terrifying days in the Tower of London because King Henry had a stomachache after gorging himself on 12 courses during a feast. It was eventually determined that the king's discomfort stemmed from his notoriously poor digestive system and his habit of eating enough for 4 men, but no one bothered to apologize to Quincy. "I'm just grateful they didn't use the rack this time," he told a fellow servant after his release. The question most food tasters dreaded wasn't, "Is this poisoned?" but rather, "Who hired you?" Royal courts were cesspools of intrigue, and everyone suspected everyone else of plotting assassination. Food tasters often found themselves caught in the middle, pressured by different factions to either identify poisons or purposely miss them. During one particularly tense period when Henry VIII was seeking to divorce and of Cleves, Quincy was approached by no fewer than 3 different court factions in one day. One wanted to ensure the king's safety. Another hinted he should perhaps overlook certain substances in the king's wine. And a third simply wanted information about what the king ate, when, and with whom. "The worst part is," Quincy complained to the royal dog keeper, "they all offered me the same pathetic bribe. Apparently my life is worth exactly 4 shillings and a promise not to have me executed." Perhaps the cruelest aspect of being a food taster was the way it ruined the simple pleasure of eating. When every bite could be your last, mealtime becomes less about enjoyment and more about fearful analysis. Food tasters developed paranoia that outlasted their service. Those lucky few who survived their tenure often couldn't enjoy meals for the rest of their lives, always sniffing, inspecting, and taking tiny bites first. Wilamina, after serving Queen Elizabeth for 6 years and surviving, a remarkable achievement, opened a small bakery in London. Customers often noticed her peculiar habit of taking a tiny nibble of each pastry before selling it. Not the best business practice, but old habits die hard, especially when those habits kept you from dying hard. If you somehow managed to survive long enough to retire from food tasting, a rare achievement indeed, you didn't receive a pension, a ceremony, or even a thanks for taking all those potential poisonings from me. The best you could hope for was being forgotten rather than eliminated as someone who knew too much about royal security procedures. Quincy Hemsworth actually did survive his year of service, mainly because King Henry was more concerned with beheading wives than being poisoned during that particular period. When his sentence ended, Quincy was simply dismissed with a curt nod and a warning never to speak of what he'd witnessed in the royal kitchens. "What about a reference letter?" Quincy dared to ask the royal steward. "A reference for what?" The steward replied, genuinely confused. "Your expertise in not dying? I suggest you take up something safer, like cleaning chamber pots or testing the structural integrity of siege weapons." So there you have it. Being a royal food taster in medieval times meant living in constant fear, receiving zero appreciation, and developing the sort of trust issues that would keep a modern therapist employed for decades. You were simultaneously the most important servant at mealtime and the most disposable person in the room. In perhaps the final cruel irony, historical records rarely mention food tasters by name. These people literally put their lives on the line with every meal, yet history remembers the kings who stayed safe, not the servants who kept them that way. As Wilamina Northcott reportedly quipped on her deathbed, of natural causes at the impressive age of 63, "I spent my youth terrified of being poisoned only to die of old age. Somehow, that feels like the biggest poison of all. The bitter taste of a life spent keeping others safe while never feeling secure myself." So the next time you sit down to a meal without worrying whether it might kill you, raise a glass to the forgotten food tasters of history, the people who turned dying before dessert from a metaphor into an occupational hazard.